Hi, Ron White from Arcadian Quilt Studio. We quilters are encouraged to document our quilts, put labels on them and things like that. There's other ways to document your quilts. One is to make a scrapbook. Have you ever had quilts that you made the quilts, but you no longer have the quilts? Maybe you gave them to a niece or a nephew. Maybe you sold them. Maybe they were lost in some tragedy like a fire or a flood. So the scrap way is a way for you to enjoy the quilts, reminisce about quilts that you miss because you don't no longer have them. So what I have here is I have uh, a quilt album of the 28 quilts that I've made to date. And what I've done is I've got basically 4 pages for every quilt. The first page is an 8.5 by 11 glossy of the front of the quilt. And the back is an 8.5 by 11 glossy of the back. Now sometimes you can see the quilting and sometimes you just see the fabric, but you can see and remember what interesting choices you may have made for the backing of the quilt. Then there's, if you still have the fabric left over from the quilt, move that too soon. If you still have fabric left over from the making of the quilt, you can take whatever size scraps of those fabrics that you like and you can sew them together so that they don't get all messed up, and you can put them in the sleeve and see, because we know as photographers, well, not all of us are photographers, but we know that when you take a photograph and you print it out, a lot of times it's very, very hard to get that photograph to look exactly like what you photographed in real life. And this is especially true of quilts, especially scrap quilts, where you have just so many colors um, to try to match. So having these fabric scraps will help you even if you haven't been able to realistically capture the quilt. The last page of each quilt is what I went through with that quilt. It's some statistics of the quilt. For example, this is called Colorado Log Cabin. I have the size of the quilt and how many pieces with the quilt. When I started it, when I finished it, this happened to be my sixth quilt finished, and I do still have this quilt. And then, how you came to make this quilt, what you learned. So this was actually a project. There's a quilt shop in Indianapolis that's been for 20, 30 years. And they're actually in Lebanon, Indiana now, but Quilts Plus. And I lived 10 minutes walk from Quilts Plus for 20 years and took many classes there, took my first class, learned to quilt there, took many classes, went to many retreats and Thimbleberries camps, and enjoyed the time there with my fellow quilters making these quilts. And so this was a class. The teacher was Carolyn Liebel. She taught many classes. She was an excellent quilt teacher, taught many classes at Quilts Plus. And this was in February of 2002. And how I made it, this was machine pieced, machine quilted. And then on this particular quilt, and some of you have been through this, see the stars here? I had in my mind's eye the fabric that I wanted for the stars. And I went to all the quilt shops in the Indianapolis area. And one of the quilt shops has 16,000 different quilt fabrics. I went to all these shops and I just could not find that fabric that I had in my mind's eye. So I bought 3 second choices, and I looked at those for 2 weeks before I could actually decide on my quote second choice. And I am happy with this fabric that's in this quilt, but it just wasn't the one that I had in my mind's eye. So those are some of the kinds of things that you can remember, you can enjoy, you can reminisce about. You can also look, at your progress, because if we go back to my first quilt, this was also a class from Carolyn Liebel, and it was supposed to be done, it was a beginning quilt class. It was supposed to be done entirely by hand, and I did that for either 2 of these 6 blocks. But, I have a long-standing joke. I've spent thousands of dollars on quilting machines and sewing machines so that I never have to sew anything by hand. So I tried to be good, but I just couldn't take it, and I finished some of these blocks by machine. But you know, a lot of hobbies, when you first start out, you you may not get the nuance of the detail and you know how to put it together perfectly. You may not care, you know. It's like, oh, my first quilt, I want to get it done. I just want to get it done, you know. Like the baby vulture said, patience my ass. I want to kill something. And so if you really scrutinize this quilt, you definitely will see that the workmanship is just not all there. It's not the best. But hey, you know, that was my first quilt. And so then, but you can go back through and you can look at some of your projects that you've done, that you've given away to people. Um, this one here is a flannel quilt, and the backing's kind of fun because it's a bunch of mooses. So that was kind of fun. Didn't get that framed very well. You can look at some of your mistakes. You know, this was a baby quilt, and you know, with babies with their eyes developing, there's a concept that you should have a lot of contrast in a baby quilt. And the babies can see that better, enjoy that better. Sometimes us adults, not so much. And so I did follow that principle on this baby quilt, and it looked good at the time. But to me now, when I look at it, I had way too much contrast difference between especially this fabric and the rest of the fabrics. This one here is a little bit dark. It's kind of marginal, but you know, you see those kinds of things and you learn from those, and you make your quilts better as time goes on. So I encourage you, this one here, same thing with the contrast. That's probably my least favorite quilt that I've ever made. So I encourage you to do this kind of thing and, you know, document your quilts for your family. You know, some of the quilts that you make, some quilts we know last for hundreds of years. So some of the quilts that you make will outlast whatever medium you used when you made the quilt album. On the other hand, if you made quilts for nieces and nephews and grandkids, uh, your scrapbook may outlive those quilts because they're loved to death and they're meant to be loved to death, and that's okay. You want the children to get the good use and enjoyment out of those quilts and love them so much that they eventually end up wearing them out. So thanks for looking at this video. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope this will encourage many of you to make your own quilt scrapbook albums. Thank you.